So I said, have some water. And so he drank some water, and then we continued. And then when the interview was over, he he was completely relaxed, sat in the studio, and just chatted away. So that was way back when. And then in the year 2000, I was doing a special series in South Africa. And one of the advantages of these special series, I get to talk to a lot of people who are well known in their own country, but not necessarily outside. But also, going to South Africa, I wanted to talk to Nadine Gordimer and J.M. Coetzee. He had just won the Booker Prize for Disgrace, which he didn't go to London to accept and didn't give any interviews associated with. So we got in touch, and I asked if we can have an interview again. I said, I will come to Cape Town and would like to do this interview. And he said, I really don't like to do interviews, but I remember our last occasion fondly. So I will consider it. But I want to see the questions ahead of time. And I should tell you that is totally exceptional. I want to see the questions ahead of time. And I won't talk about myself, about my work, or about South Africa. Well, as you know, I'm very tenacious. So we sent in, I worked with Sandra Rabinovich, I worked with my producer on the special series, and we sent in a series of questions. And I guess they somehow came a little bit too close to one of those 3 forbidden subjects. So he sent them back, and he said he didn't really think it was going to work. And I was so determined. And I also know he's a beautiful reader, and he agreed he would read from Disgrace. So I remembered that he had written a lot of critical work about Beckett and Dostoevsky, and if we just focused it on those writers and people that he'd written about, that maybe we could get away with it. And he agreed. And so it was a very strange interview. I actually was able to work in a little bit at the beginning about his background because he had written these memoirs, but I knew I couldn't ask directly, but I talked about language and speaking Afrikaans and speaking English and the culture and that sort of thing. And he also, very charming of him, when I asked the questions, he'd respond as if he had never heard it before. I mean, he wouldn't go so far as to say, well, that's a good question, but, you know, he responded. And I also did allow myself a little bit of follow-up, and it was in Cape Town. I'd been warned, I'd met one of his friends the day before, and it was around his 60th birthday, and I was warned not to bring that up.
In fact, it's a great interview, actually. It's a really interesting interview.
Well, you published it in Brick.
You published it in Brick, yeah. And just a wonderful interview, because he really is talking about very specific things, and he's so careful. You mean the New Testament or the Old Testament? When you're asking him about the Bible.
Well, I know one of my friends came into the program late. I mean, when we broadcast it, I said what had happened, and one of my friends heard the program on the radio, and she missed the beginning, and she's listening, and there's no discussion of his life, his work, or Disgrace, or South Africa. She called me up and said, what happened? Did you get hit by a brick or something?
I think, do you have a bit?
Do you want to play some or not? No, I think we won't. I think we won't.
I thought I had a Coetzee sighting once. So we were in California, and we were in this Mexican restaurant, and there was Coetzee sitting, and it was definitely Coetzee looking anyway. But he was eating a huge steak and was with 2 blondes. So perhaps he wasn't him.
Well, he lives in Australia now.
Yeah. I think one of the...
Have you met him?
No, never met him. I think one of the really wonderful things Writers and Company has been doing lately is a series where you've got, well, not just lately, but you've traveled to another country and interviewed writers there, such as you've gone to India, Berlin, Russia, Turkey, South Africa, the Middle East, and New Zealand. And what made you, first of all, go towards doing something? What made you go towards doing this kind of program? And What stands out for you among this series?
I can't remember where the idea first came from to go to a country and interview a whole bunch of writers from that place. I know that I wanted to do it even before I was able to, even before I had the funding. Even in the early and mid-90s, I ended up doing a series of interviews with African writers in exile, but through studios and not actually getting to go there. I remember doing the same thing with some writers from Ireland, and it was terrible at the end of one of the interviews when one of the writers said, "Well, it's too bad you're not here. We could go out and sink a pint." But finally, I think the first major series was in 1998 to go to India, and I used as the occasion the 50th anniversary of independence, which I know was in 47, 97, but the Indian celebration of that 50th anniversary was actually a little bit late. And the tremendous advantage of going to a country is to talk to writers who aren't that well known outside the country. So, for instance, in India, I had already interviewed Salman Rushdie and Arundhati Roy and Anita Desai, but this was an opportunity to meet writers who weren't known outside the country, and also to talk to them using that occasion, like the 50th anniversary, you get a moment, a hinge moment in a way to bring in social and political issues to the conversation, and to interview writers in their home. I remember in India, for instance, interviewing Nayantara Sehgal, who is Nehru's niece, and she lives in Dehradun in the foothills of the Himalayas, and she was Indira Gandhi's cousin. I mean, it was going to her house and seeing the photographs on the walls and just talking to her about growing up through that whole period of the fight for Indian independence. And another writer at the same time was Shashi Deshpande, who lives in Bangalore. And I remember that in particular because it was so hot. And at that time, I used a little mini disc player and one microphone. And before I arrived, she closed all the windows because it was very noisy and there was construction and a lot of noise coming from outside on the street. And I made her turn off the fan because it would have created too much noise during the interview. And we were both sitting there and we started taking various garments off. And the microphone was sliding through my fingers during the interview. But I mean, you wouldn't know if you weren't there. But it was memorable.
And I think you also went to Chile, didn't you, at one point? But that was
just last February.
Yeah, yeah. But you were there before.
I arrived the day of the earthquake.
So when you are in another country, it's a program of non sequiturs, but don't worry. When you are in another country, does your character as an interviewer change?
Apart from sweating visibly?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think so. I think there's probably a little bit more informality when I get to interview someone face-to-face or I get to interview them in their home. And there's also often a kind of reciprocal warmth because I've traveled all this way to interview them. And very often the authors are very gracious and welcoming and hospitable. And I mean, interviewing David Malouf in Sydney, and then he invited me for lunch and things like that. So I don't know that I'm different, but it's certainly a more gratifying experience. And even meeting people for the first time, they're often, I remember in Buenos Aires, Guillermo Martinez and his wife offered to show me around the next day because I had some time. It's a terrific opportunity to learn more about the country as well. But I don't know that I change. Do you change when you travel?
Yeah, I find if I'm being interviewed or speaking in another country, I make much grander statements. You know, I mean, make almost semi-political speeches. You know, but I just wonder if the same thing is here. Does David Malouf? Is he different in Canada as opposed to being in Sydney? Or, you know, I think that's kind of interesting because the writer, in his own place, has a certain kind of. They tend to hide more, you know, from their own landscape. Whereas if you're in some other country, you can pretend something else.